May 7th, 1945. A makeshift processing camp near Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The spring mud still holds the metallic scent of tank treads and spent gunpowder. She stood there, 23 years old, in a Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform 2 sizes too large, her hands trembling as American MPs gestured toward the medical tent. What happened in the next 17 minutes would haunt the soldiers who witnessed it, not because of what they saw, but because of what they chose not to see. Because sometimes the most profound acts of humanity occur in the smallest gestures of dignity. And on that May afternoon, as the Third Reich collapsed into ash and memory, a group of young American GIs would demonstrate something the Nazi propaganda machine had told her was impossible, that the enemy could choose mercy over humiliation, compassion over conquest, respect over revenge. This is the story of what happened when ideological certainty met human decency, when the machinery of total war paused just for a moment to remember what it meant to see another person, really see them, not as a uniform or a flag or a cause, but as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who was afraid. The war in Europe was dying, but it was a slow death, messy and complicated. By early May 1945, the Wehrmacht wasn't so much retreating as dissolving, units fragmenting, officers abandoning commands, soldiers walking west toward the Americans and British rather than east toward the Soviets. Everyone knew what awaited them in the east. The reports had been filtering through for weeks. Nemmersdorf, Königsberg, Berlin itself. What the Red Army did to German women wasn't discussed in official dispatches, but every soldier knew. Every woman in uniform knew even better. The Wehrmacht had employed over 500,000 women in auxiliary roles by 1945, the Wehrmacht Helferinnen. Telephone operators, radio technicians, administrative clerks, searchlight operators, even anti-aircraft gun crews. They weren't soldiers, not legally, but they wore field gray uniforms and they worked within military structures, which made their status in captivity dangerously ambiguous. Geneva Convention protections applied to military combatants, but what were these women? Combatants? Civilians? Something in between? The answer often depended on who captured them and where and what mood the victors were in when the surrender came. By May 7th, one day before Germany's official unconditional surrender, American Third Army units under Patton's command were processing thousands of POWs daily across Czechoslovakia and Bavaria. The logistical challenge was staggering. At the Pilsen processing center alone, MPs were documenting nearly 5,000 POWs every 24 hours. Teenage Hitlerjugend conscripts still wearing shorts, elderly Volkssturm men with hunting rifles, SS officers who'd burned their uniforms and claimed to be clerks, Luftwaffe pilots without planes, and increasingly, women. The women were always the complicated ones. Sergeant James Whitmore, a 26-year-old MP from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had been running intake processing for 3 days straight. He'd seen Wehrmacht majors weep like children. He'd watched 17-year-old boys hold hands because they were too scared to stand alone. He'd documented men with frostbite so severe their toes had turned black. Men with infected wounds wrapped in newspaper. Men who'd eaten nothing but tree bark for a week. But the women, they carried a different kind of fear. You could see it in their eyes, the way they stood, always in groups if possible, always watching the soldiers watching them. They think we're going to do what their side did. They think we're animals like they were told. And the sad thing is, after what we've seen, the camps, the villages, the bodies, part of me doesn't care what they think. But then you look at them, really look, and they're just scared kids in uniforms that don't fit. The woman who would later be identified only as Margareta S. in declassified U.S. Army records arrived at the Pilsen camp on the morning of May 7th as part of a larger group, 43 women from a Wehrmacht communications unit that had been stationed near Karlsbad before the collapse. They'd walked for 2 days, sleeping in abandoned barns, drinking from streams, following the masses of surrendering troops westward. Better the Americans than the Russians. That was the calculus. That was the hope. Standard processing procedure required medical screening, checking for typhus, tuberculosis, wounds requiring treatment, and lice infestation. The procedure was clinical, efficient, and conducted by U.S. Army medical personnel in designated tents. For male POWs, this meant a quick examination, delousing powder if needed, and documentation. For female POWs, the procedure was essentially the same, but the psychological weight was entirely different. Margareta S. had been a telephone switchboard operator in Karlsbad before the war, routing military communications, connecting calls from officers to field units, listening to the war through crackling lines and desperate voices. She was from Dresden, or what remained of Dresden after February 1945, when the firebombing had turned the Baroque city into a crematorium. Her family had fled to relatives in the countryside. She hadn't heard from them in 7 weeks. The last letter mentioned food shortages and Soviet tanks seen 30 kilometers to the east. She'd volunteered for the Wehrmacht Helferinnen in 1943, not out of ideological fervor, but because it meant regular meals and a paycheck to send home. By 1945, ideology was a luxury. Survival was the only politics that mattered. When the medical processing officer called her group forward, 12 women to be examined in the larger medical tent, Margareta felt her stomach twist into a knot. She heard stories, not from Americans. There were no stories about Americans yet. The encounter was too new. But from the general anxiety that permeated every female POW group. Stories from the Eastern Front. Stories about what victorious armies did to conquered women. Stories that probably weren't all propaganda. The medical tent was canvas stretched over wooden frames, open on both ends for ventilation. Inside, 3 folding examination tables, medical supplies stacked in crates, and Captain Howard Chen, a Chinese-American Army doctor from San Francisco who'd been processing POWs for 11 hours and was running on coffee and residual adrenaline. The procedure was standard: remove outer Army uniform layers, visual inspection for wounds or disease, check for lice, document any medical concerns, issue delousing powder if needed, provide basic medical treatment if required. It took approximately 4 minutes per person. It was impersonal, professional, and completely routine. Except that there were American soldiers everywhere, MPs maintaining order, clerks documenting names, supply sergeants distributing blankets and rations, and more significantly, the tent walls were thin canvas, effectively translucent in the afternoon light, and the tent openings faced the main processing yard, where hundreds of recently captured German soldiers waited in long queues, watched by dozens of American guards. Margareta understood the medical necessity. She understood the procedure was probably the same as what she'd have experienced in German military processing. She understood that these were doctors doing their jobs. But understanding something intellectually doesn't stop the body's fear response, doesn't stop the feeling of exposure, vulnerability, shame, particularly for a young woman raised in 1930s Germany, where modesty was morality, and female bodies were either idealized for breeding or condemned for existing outside prescribed roles. What happened next would later be documented in multiple sources: Sergeant Whitmore's letters home, Captain Chen's diary, Red Cross observer reports, and post-war interviews with former POWs conducted in the 1970s by German historians researching women's experiences in the Wehrmacht auxiliary services. As the first women in the group were called forward for examination, Margareta began to shake. Not visibly, she maintained the rigid composure that Wehrmacht discipline demanded, but internally, her entire body trembling with a fear she couldn't articulate.
When her turn came, when the medical officer gestured for her to step behind the canvas privacy screen, such as it was, and remove her uniform tunic for examination, she froze. "Bitte," she said quietly. "Please," her voice barely audible over the camp noise outside. "Nicht vor allen," not in front of everyone. Captain Chen looked up from his clipboard. He'd processed perhaps 60 POWs that morning, male and female, and most encounters were so routine he barely registered individual faces anymore. But something in her voice stopped him, the absolute terror beneath the disciplined posture, the way her hands gripped the hem of her tunic, the realization that to her this wasn't a medical procedure, it was something else entirely. He glanced around the tent. 5 American soldiers within direct view, canvas walls showing silhouettes, open tent flaps facing the processing yard, hundreds of eyes, technically, even if none were specifically watching this particular examination. Protocol said proceed with the examination. Medical necessity superseded individual comfort. There was no time for special accommodations. There were
Marguerite S. received her POW documentation card, number W17384, assigned to Women's Detention Facility 4, Pilsen. Expected processing for civilian repatriation, 3 to 6 weeks. She would be released on June 23, 1945, and would eventually make her way back to what remained of Dresden, where she'd find her mother and younger sister alive, her father and brother missing, presumed dead in the war's final chaos. She would marry in 1948, have 3 children, work as a secretary, and live until 1993. She would tell her children almost nothing about the war, but she would tell her granddaughter about the American doctor who turned away. The story doesn't end there, though, because what happened in that tent wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern that emerged in the final weeks of the European war, a pattern that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had promised about American brutality. The ideological preparation of German women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary services had been extensive and explicit. From 1943 onward, as the Eastern Front collapsed and the prospect of occupation became real, Nazi propaganda intensified its messaging about Allied soldiers, particularly Soviet forces, but also Americans and British. The narrative was designed to prevent surrender, to make captivity seem worse than death, to keep women serving the regime until the absolute end. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels' office distributed specific talking points to Wehrmacht training officers in 1944. American soldiers were portrayed as racially impure mongrels, incapable of self-discipline, prone to alcoholism and sexual violence. African American troops, which Germany's propaganda called African colonial savages, were described as particularly dangerous. The message was clear. Surrender to the Americans meant rape, humiliation, and death. Better to fight to the end. Better to die in uniform than suffer capture. By early 1945, as Germany's situation became desperate, the propaganda grew more shrill. Radio broadcasts described American POW camps as death camps, a psychological projection given what Americans were simultaneously discovering at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. Leaflets distributed to female auxiliaries claimed that American soldiers carried special orders to humiliate German women, that photographing nude prisoners was standard procedure, that sexual assault was systematic policy. Some of this propaganda built on real events. Isolated incidents of misconduct by Allied soldiers certainly occurred, as they do in any war. But the systematic nature described in Nazi propaganda was fiction, designed to weaponize fear. The reality that German POWs encountered in American captivity was stark, and the cognitive dissonance was profound.
Wehrmacht soldier Hans Woltersdorf, captured near Remagen in March 1945, wrote in his diary, later published as part of a 1968 memoir, "They gave us chocolate, actual chocolate. We'd been told they would torture us for information, that capture meant death. Instead, they gave us chocolate and cigarettes and asked polite questions. I felt confused, angry even. Had we been lied to about everything?" The answer, of course, was yes, but not just by their side. American soldiers in 1945 were also products of propaganda. They'd been seen Why We Fight films depicting Germans as goose-stepping automatons. They'd seen newsreels of concentration camps. They'd heard stories about SS massacres of American POWs at Malmedy. Many arrived in Europe expecting to hate every German they encountered, expecting that every prisoner would be a fanatic Nazi, that mercy would be wasted on people who'd shown no mercy themselves. And then they met actual German soldiers and auxiliaries, exhausted, starving, terrified teenagers and older men who'd been conscripted in the war's final desperate months. People who didn't look like monsters, people who looked like the enemy soldiers looked in every war, tired, scared, human. This created its own confusion, its own moral complications. Private Robert Capa, not the famous photographer, but a different soldier with the same name, an infantryman from the 90th Division, wrote to his sister in May 1945, "I don't know how to feel anymore. We saw the camps, we saw what they did, and I'm supposed to hate them, and I do hate them, whoever them is. But then we're processing these prisoners, and they're just kids, Mary, farm boys who don't know anything about politics, women who were just answering telephones. And I think about how I'd want someone to treat you if you'd been caught up in this, if you'd been wearing the wrong uniform. I don't know. Maybe hatred is easier when you don't have to look at faces." This tension between the desire for revenge and the obligation to decency played out thousands of times daily across occupied Germany in spring 1945. And while there were certainly American soldiers who chose cruelty, court-martial records document numerous cases of misconduct, assault, and theft by U.S. personnel. The broader institutional policy and the majority of individual behavior leaned toward what military historians call correct treatment, adherence to Geneva Convention standards, provision of food and medical care, maintenance of basic dignity. For German POWs, especially women, this was psychologically destabilizing. Everything they'd been told suggested surrender, particularly to Americans, would mean violation and humiliation. When it didn't, when American soldiers instead turned away to preserve privacy, when doctors provided medical care without exploitation, when guards distributed food that was better than what Wehrmacht soldiers had eaten in months, the entire ideological structure began to collapse. Psychologist Robert J. Lifton, in his 1973 work on thought reform and totalism, describes this process as paradigm rupture, when lived experience contradicts fundamental beliefs so thoroughly that the entire worldview must be reconsidered. For many German POWs in 1945, American decency was precisely such a rupture. Marguerite S., in that 1977 interview, described it this way: "We'd been taught that the Americans represented chaos, that they had no culture, no honor, no discipline. That's what they told us to explain why we were superior, why we had to win. And then I stood in that tent, terrified, and an American officer ordered his own soldiers to turn away. He gave me privacy and dignity when he had absolutely no obligation to do so. That's when I realized everything I believed was a lie. Not just small lies about battles or politics, but fundamental lies about what it meant to be human, about who was civilized and who wasn't. The documents exist, buried in National Archives files that weren't fully declassified until the 1990s, showing that Captain Chen's decision to evacuate the medical tent was not unique, but it was also not universal or mandated by official policy. Some medical officers provided privacy, others did not. Some POW camps maintained strict separation of male and female prisoners with appropriate accommodations. Others were chaotic and dangerous. The American military in 1945 was not a monolith. It contained both heroes and criminals, both extraordinary compassion and casual brutality, often within the same unit. What made incidents like the Pilsen medical tent significant wasn't that they represented universal American virtue. They didn't. Rather, they demonstrated that even in total war, even in an army that had just liberated death camps and witnessed unspeakable atrocities, individual human beings could still choose dignity over degradation, respect over revenge. This matters because it complicates the narrative. It's easier to tell stories about absolute good and absolute evil, about heroes and monsters, about clear moral lines. But May 1945 in Central Europe wasn't that simple. American soldiers were simultaneously liberating death camps and looting German homes. German soldiers were simultaneously committing final atrocities and surrendering peacefully. Women like Marguerite S. were simultaneously victims of Nazi ideology and participants in the Wehrmacht system. Everyone was compromised. Everyone was complicated. And yet, in that complexity, individual choices still mattered. Captain Chen could have followed standard procedure. It was efficient, defensible, and completely within regulations. Instead, he chose 4 seconds of empathy. Sergeant Whitmore and the other Americans in that tent could have resisted, complained about special treatment